Welcome to EduRev.
Hi guys, welcome to EduRev. My name is Harshmeet Singh and I welcome you all to this next lecture in the chapter Making of the Indian Constitution. This is the fourth part of this video lecture. I hope you have seen the earlier three parts in which we had discussed about the Constituent Assembly of India, कैसे इलेक्शन हुआ था, how did or why did the Muslim League and the princely states boycott the assembly, partition के समय क्या फर्क पड़ा था assembly में, and some other details about the Constituent Assembly. In this class, we will go into details of the working of the assembly. क्या काम किया था Constituent Assembly ने, how were they working, the processes that were followed, etc. etc. As I told you earlier, जो पहली मीटिंग थी असेंबली की, that was held on 9th of December 1946. So independence से पहले ही the first meeting was held. Now when the first meeting was held, obviously there was no one amongst the people who were in the assembly to preside over the house. ऐसा नया लोकसभा लगता है जब you don't have a speaker, right? That is why the senior most member amongst themselves, जो सब में senior most था, that was Dr. Sachidanand Sinha. He was appointed as the temporary president. This was as per a French practice. France में ऐसा होता है, when the parliament starts on the very first day, since you don't have someone to preside over the house, election कराने के लिए you need someone to be presiding over the house, you elect the senior most member. So Dr. Sachidanand Sinha, by the virtue of being the senior most member of the house, was elected as the temporary president. Temporary why? Because he was there just for 2 days. On 11th of December 1946, the assembly voted to elect their full-time president. This full-time president was Dr. Rajendra Prasad. Now remember, assembly was not electing Rajendra Prasad as a president of India. He was being elected as a president of the Constituent Assembly. Along with him, there was a vice president who was elected, that was H.C. Mukherjee. Remember, later on, when the Constituent Assembly started to function in 1948, there was a second vice president also who was appointed. We will talk about that later. But initially, on just the third day of their meeting, it was H.C. Mukherjee who was appointed as a vice president of the Assembly. There was one more office bearer who was appointed, that was Sir B.N. Rao. Sir Benegal Rao as the constitutional advisor. Now, he was a very well-renowned judge of that time. In fact, he even represented India in the International Court of Justice. That is a UN court that we have today. He also served in that court. So, he was made the constitutional advisor to advise the Constituent Assembly in how to make laws and how to go about everything, etc. etc. Now, UPSC is extremely fond of asking questions about chronology of events. Chronology of people, chronology of events, what came first, what came second, what came third, etc. It's a very, very common kind of question that is asked in the UPSC exam. That is why what we have done here is we have tried to give you a timeline of all the important events. Now, you don't have to remember the date of each and every event, but you surely must remember what came first, what came second, what came after that, etc. etc. Now, 13th of December, that is within a week of the assembly started to function, Jawaharlal Nehru introduced what we call as the Objectives Resolution. We had discussed this earlier when we were reading about the preamble. Objectives Resolution was what became the preamble later on. It was the first thing discussed in the assembly. It said what are the objectives of the assembly, what is it that we want to do. For example, we want to make India a sovereign country, we want to make India a democratic, a republican country. So that is what the objectives resolution was. It was discussed for over a month, and on 22nd of Jan it was adopted by the assembly. On 22nd of July 1947, in the same year, that is, national flag was adopted. 15th August, we achieved independence and India was officially divided into Pakistan and India. As you can see, there are a lot of things in the assembly that happened even before we officially attained independence. Do remember that part. On 29th of August 1947, the drafting committee was appointed. with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as a chairman. We will read about the committees later on, but for now, remember, the Constituent Assembly worked by dividing themselves into multiple committees. Committees for various purposes. For example, there was a Fundamental Rights Committee, there was a Minorities Committee, there was a States Committee, there was a Union Powers Committee. Amongst them, one of the most important committee that was given the charge of collecting all the opinions and finally drafting them in the constitution was the drafting committee. The drafting committee was headed by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and it was made on 29th of August 1947. On 16th of July 1948, this is when second vice president was also elected in the assembly. As I said in the very beginning, on 11th of December, we had a president and a vice president elected in the assembly. Dr. Rajendra Prasad as a president, H.C. Mukherjee as a vice president. But now, about 1.5 years later, on 16th of July 1948, a second vice president was also appointed in the assembly. He was V.T. Krishnamachari. On 26th of November 1949, the Constitution of India was finally passed and adopted by the assembly. I discussed with you earlier also how some parts of the Constitution, some very few articles of the Constitution came into force on 26 November itself. The list of those articles is itself given in Article 394. Remember, our Constitution, that is the original Constitution that was made, had a total of 395 articles, 8 schedules and 22 parts in which it was divided. Now, the Constitution of India the Constituent Assembly of India had its last meeting on 24th of January 1950. Remember the fact, till now, elections have not been held for the government of India. The government that is running, that is the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, Law Minister, these are appointed by the British before India had become independent. Elections for the very first government of Free India were only held in 1951-52, meaning that we officially did not have any parliament. That is why when the Constituent Assembly, when they finished the work of constitution making, when the constitution was enacted on 26 Jan 1950, the same people in the Constituent Assembly, they turned themselves into the parliament. So they were the same set of people, they came to the same place, they had the same kind of meetings. The only difference now was that from now onwards, they would be called the Parliament of India. Earlier, they were the Constituent Assembly of India. That was the only thing that had changed. Here is an important question I would like you to read carefully and answer. First statement, the Constituent Assembly was proposed by M.N. Roy. Second, the first meeting of the Assembly was held on 9th December 1946. Third, the Constitution came into force on 26 Jan 1950. We have discussed all these three and all these three are correct. We had discussed in the very first class of this chapter, M.N. Roy was the first Indian in 1934 to give this idea that Indians should make their own constitution and no one else. In 1938, Congress also gave support to this idea. The second statement is also correct as we have just studied, and the third is also absolutely correct. Remember, the Constitution came into force on this date and it was adopted on 26 November. So do remember the difference between adopted and enacted. Enacted would be on 26 Jan. So the answer here is D. All of these are correct. Thank you so much for watching this lecture.